my distinct privilege to introduce our keynote speaker, probably one of the key people whom you've come to see here, and this is Mr. Dave Snowden. There's one of the tests you have to pass is you have to pronounce his company, and it's Cynefin. He is founder of and chief scientific officer of a company called Cynefin, and Dave is very well known for developing the Cynefin framework, which is widely used. A colleague of mine who's leading the government session says that he uses it frequently in his work. It's basically used for sense-making in a variety of complexity scenarios. Mr. Snowden's consulting services are in demand worldwide in the public sector and elsewhere. He holds the BA in philosophy from Lancaster University, an underappreciated field in my opinion, and an MBA from Middlesex Polytechnic. Welcome, Mr. Snowden.
Okay, firstly, it's nice to be back. Banff was a lot nicer than Washington, which I think that was the last time I was with this group. But it's always a pleasure to come to Washington, particularly Arlington. I spent about 10 years of my life commuting here for 2 weeks out of every 4. When I was co-leading a DARPA program with SRI over in Menlo Park, which was looking initially at how do you get people to make decisions when they come from radically different political backgrounds. And the way they assess the data is based on what they actually want to do. That completed its work the day before 9/11, just down the road here. Very successful project. We actually had 50 American historians from different backgrounds, and we took them through an archetypal process, which meant for the first time ever, they could discuss something objectively. And we thought we would carry on with that. I flew back to London, picked up the news of 9/11 as I was driving up from Heathrow, and after that, everything changed. All right? So the work fundamentally refocused onto weak signal detection. And the essence of that is how do you work out in advance yet what you should pay attention to, which with the benefit of hindsight, you know you should have. So if you look at 9/11, and I want to start off with a few points, and the people who were at my workshop yesterday, you're not allowed to answer this for people, right? One of the key things on this is if you look at the build-up to 9/11, one of the FBI agents spotted that people were being trained to take off and fly but not land. Everybody remember that? And everybody looked with the benefit of hindsight and said we should have paid attention to her. Now, statistically, she's less likely to get it right or the same probability the next time round. And the key thing in the congressional report on 9/11 is it finishes off with why didn't we join up the dots? Everybody's heard that phrase? Yeah, the minute you get a congressional inquiry, an internal government inquiry, people look backwards and they say we should have joined up the dots. Yeah? Okay, so your first problem on this, and I say people who were here yesterday can't solve this. If I actually have 1, 2, 3, 4 dots, then there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 linkages that can form between the dots. So 4 dots, 6 linkages, 64 possible patterns. So a pattern is any dot, any link, or any combination thereof. Everybody got that? Right, you're going to get 15 seconds, and I want you to write a number down on a piece of paper in front of you. Everybody can bear witness, but nobody can second guess this. If I go up to 10 dots, how many patterns are there? Very quickly, just write it down. Anybody want to volunteer a number? 10 million. 10 billion. How many people think 10 billion is too high? Too low? Yeah, not answering because you avoid this on all possible occasions, yeah. Okay, I'll help you out. It's too low, yeah. The actual number is just over 3.4 trillion. If I go up to 12, it goes over 4.8 quadrillion. Interestingly, the more senior people you meet with, the lower the number they guess. I've actually had 150 from one board, and they got really upset when I told them what it was. Yeah? This is the emperor's chessboard. 1 grain of rice on the first square of the chessboard, double thereafter. There isn't enough rice in China. So how many dots are there in the human system? How many possible patterns are there? Yeah, with the benefit of hindsight, anybody can make a causal connection. But this is a fundamental principle. Hindsight doesn't lead to foresight. Right? That's really important to understand. Yeah? So what I'm going to talk about, I'm not going to go into the Cynefin framework. I did that last time in Banff. I want to lead into the new framework we're working on, which is estuarine mapping. And that's kind of like, you've got a nice picture of an estuary there. The reason we're calling it estuarine mapping is in an estuary, the water flows both ways. Yeah? And there's things you can do at the turn of the tide that you can't do when the tide is flowing. There are sandbanks you check every day. There are granite cliffs you only have to check every 10 or 15 years. The brackishness of the water, the salt content, tells you a lot about the environment. They're very complex ecosystems. Yeah? So an estuary is a really good metaphor for the decision support environment in which we all sit. And so I went for the DARPA program on to design the Singapore government's risk assessment center. And more recently, and I'll finish off with this, wrote the European Union handbook on how to manage complexity in a crisis. So there's backup material to what I'm going to talk about. The essence of everything we do within the company and within the network of which we're a part is we use natural science as what is called an enabling constraint. Right? Sorry, my background is a mixture of theoretical physics and philosophy, so I always feel nervous talking with engineers because my temptation to get into jokes about, sorry, I shouldn't go there, but I can't avoid it now. The temptation to point out experimental physicists were the people whose maths wasn't good enough to be theoretical physicists, and engineers are the ones who cope with the boring stuff once everybody else has worked it out. It's almost overwhelming, all right, in terms of the way it works. But one of the things we started to look at is in natural science, everything is subject to repeatable experiments by other parties. So you can rely on it. In social science, that isn't the case. There is a major crisis in psychology at the moment, by the way, which has a major impact on the decision profession because of their dependency on it, in that none of the classic experiments can be replicated. Right? And that actually gives you a major issue or a problem, and that's related to the sort of dots issue. So what we do is we start off with the natural science, and we say, what does that tell us about how human beings make decisions, how systems work, and then we develop methods and tools consistent with that theory. Yeah? And then after we've executed the experimental phase, we move them into operation. It takes about 6-7 years to get a method right, in theory, 4 or 5 years to get the practice right, and then you can stabilize it. Which is why I have an intense dislike of methods which are the classic Harvard approach of we'll go and study 15 companies, identify something they do, and then from that create a method. Yeah? On that basis, the most effective management education is golf lessons because there's a higher correlation between golf and executive success than anything else. All right? So we're trying to take a different approach on this. Yeah? So I'll give you my favorite illustration on this. If you give radiologists a batch of x-rays, and on the final x-ray you put a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule, 83% of radiologists will not see it, even though their eyes physically scan it. And the 17% who do see it come to believe they were wrong when they talk with the 83% who didn't. It's called inattentional blindness, and I want to develop on that in a minute. Once you realize that, you start to actually say, we've got to rethink the way we do decision making because you will not see what you do not expect to see. And the other problem in the decision profession is even if you see it, how do you persuade somebody who has the authority to act to pay attention to it? Now, this is called see, attend, act. But whether you see the data in the first place is a significant factor. Whether you pay attention to it is a separate process. And whether somebody will act on what you pay attention to is a separate process again. So if I start to build on that, then I want to start to look at basically complexity science. This is where we're coming from. This is a quote from Brian Arthur, who was the first to apply complexity science into economics. Basically, complexity is about systems which are inherently uncertain. There are so many things interacting with so many other things. The same thing only happens again the same way twice by accident, not by design. Complexity is sometimes known as the science of uncertainty. Right? And the key thing to understand about a complex system is there is no linear causality. This is actually quite scary for people who grew up in a North Atlantic tradition, because we fundamentally believe everything has a cause. And once you get into complexity, you realize that actually that's not the case. Yeah, some things just happen. If anybody has children, you already know about this. Yeah? And the danger is we have things like fundamental attribution error, retrospective coherence. We always look backwards, and then we can actually impute a purpose even if one didn't exist. The other danger is that we focus on the future state rather than the current state. Now, this has come out of systems thinking. Please don't confuse complexity science with systems thinking. They are radically different. All right? In systems thinking, the dominant approach for the last 20 or 30 years has been to decide where you want to be and try and close the gap. Now, the trouble is, if you're going to set a goal in that way, it implies you've got a causal chain and you can understand what the goal should be. If the system is complex, you can't do that. So in complexity, the key focus is to map where we are and identify where we can go next. This is also known as the Frozen 2 strategy. Has everybody seen Frozen 2? Okay, you've now got a good excuse to watch it, all right? Professor Snowden told you to, right? It's a great complexity movie. In the middle of the movie, the real heroine of the Frozen series, who's the young sister without the magic, who's lost in despair, doesn't know where she's going, she's lost her sister, she's lost her mentor, but she knows where she is, and she sings this beautiful song, "All I can do is do the next right thing." Now, in complexity science, that is called the adjacent possible. You can't know the future state, but you can know where you are, and you can identify where you can step next. If you try and set explicit goals, you actually risk the danger of people achieving the goals regardless of the consequences. Sorry, I'm being a bit rude here. Unintended consequences are the only thing you know is certain in a complex adaptive system, and explicit goals produce perverse incentives. People focus on goal achievement, not the thing which is meant to be achieved. The other danger you've got is you start to believe you can create rules. We've done a whole series of projects with blue light services which have identified the main cause of mental breakdown is the safety rules, not the job. And I'll come on to that in a second and explain why. Because the rules assume you can know what the right thing is to do, and the reality is a lot more messy than that. And the trouble is, and nurses around the world have to break the safety rules 3 to 4 times a day to provide empathetic care to patients. Engineers in Boeing, when I worked there, had to break the rules 2 or 3 times a day to get the job done. And the reason for this is the rules have been developed and worked on the basis that I can study what happened in the past, and from that I can devise rules which prevent repetition of that occurrence. Now the reality is it wasn't going to happen again the same way twice. You've also got the problem that when people look backwards, they remember things differently. We did a project on this in IBM with outsourcing contracts. Outsourcing contracts are huge ones, $15, $20 million bid budget. And one day you're hero or villain because you've won or lost the contract. So we did a lessons learned exercise the day before people knew whether they'd won or lost. And we repeated exactly the same exercise the day after they knew whether they won or lost. And you would think you were in different universes. Right? Actually, the description of what had happened before they knew the result was quite rich and dense. After they won, the guys who won then changed their story. I mean, this isn't deliberate. They weren't being malicious. They just remembered things differently. They'd been on a hero's journey. They made all the right decisions. They were wonderful. They were brilliant. Right? The guys who failed, there were 2 options there. One was they actually said, we missed this, we should have paid attention to it. The others were, well, we didn't have the right resource, we told you this wouldn't work. And we ended up with a very simple rule out of that, which is actually we broke up the successful teams because they couldn't be trusted to get it right next time because they were overconfident. We fired the teams who made excuses, and we kept the teams who had learned together, and they were always successful the second or the third time. Now, that's a lesson in that in its own right. But the key point I'm trying to get across is they remembered things differently based on the needs of the present state. So part of your problem is by looking backwards, you gather data, and it's filtered through what we need to say in the current moment. And you can't stop that. That's human nature in that sense. The other problem is we then assume that things follow a distribution curve, and we assume that distribution curve is one of these things, the famous or infamous bell curve. We all know about bell curves because we're all into decision analytics. All God's children love bell curves because we can eliminate the outliers. And we like to eliminate outliers. And then we can create things in the center. Now, the trouble is, if you look at virtually anything in a human system or a natural system, and you do a double log scale of size against frequency, you get a distribution pattern which looks like this. And I can draw a straight line through that, which is called a power law. The best person on this, by the way, is Didier. I mean, Taleb is the most famous, but Didier is another one, a former geophysicist. It's not straight there, and that's going to be significant in a minute. Now, the bell curve is a type of Gaussian distribution. The power law is a type of Pareto distribution. Yeah? And if I overlay one on the other, so just to explain the Pareto, there are a lot of small earthquakes, a small number of large earthquakes, a lot of small software errors, a small number of large software errors, and so on. Yeah, that's a Pareto distribution. If I overlay one on the other, it looks like this. So actually, the tail, which I eliminated because it had nothing in it, or nothing significant in it, now has a lot, sometimes known as a fat tail. Yeah? And that is one of the reasons, because most people's day-to-day lives are spent in the tails of a Pareto distribution, not in the center of a normal or Gaussian distribution. Now, in the middle of this, right, I haven't drawn that very well. Let's just get that a bit better. In the middle of this, here, I've got a many-to-many relationship between the past and the future. So nothing is going to happen in the present or the future which hasn't already happened substantially the same way in the past. So I can use statements about the past to forecast or predict the future state. I can project forwards. I can do things like backcasting and so on. So here, I've got a highly ordered system, and I can make predictions. As I move here, life gets a bit more interesting because I've now got an increasing amount of novelty, and even when the past repeats, I've got mutation or minor changes. So I have got a relationship between the past and the future, but it's not a one-to-one relationship anymore. It has ambiguity. And here we have lots of techniques, cone of possibilities, contingency planning. And this, by the way, is where scenario planning fits. Because scenario assumes some knowledge or projection of the past. So nothing wrong with any of these. These are really useful. The point is, up to this point, the logic we are using is inductive. So you all know your logic. Deduction, all the A equal, if A then B. Induction, all the cases of A have B, so I can assume some connection. This, by the way, is the entire scope of artificial intelligence. Yeah, everybody forgets this. Yeah, it's actually artificial inference. It is not artificial intelligence, because it's what it's trained on. It then projects forward. Just to really scare you, 30% of academic citations generated by AI in the last 2 years are plausible but not real. Yeah, and that is a thing we are going to face over the next 2 or 3 years, is plausibility which is not based on fact. Because it's just a probability projection going forwards from what we already know. And I'll talk a bit about this in a minute on the criticality for the decision profession. As I move out here, I've got a massive difference, and here I have to think abductively, not inductively. Abduction is a great contribution of American philosophy to logic. Abduction is known as the logic of hunches. So it's what's the most plausible connection between apparently unconnected things. And human beings evolve for that, not for induction. We naturally make novel connections. The upside of that is it makes us very innovative. The downside is it makes us very prone to conspiracy theories. Yeah, I am now in the home of conspiracy theories, so you all know about this, all right? Now, once you start to realize that, you start to realize that it's almost like if you know quantum mechanics, it's like Heisenberg's cusp. On one side, you can do one thing. On the other side, you have to do something radically different because the same phenomena don't apply. Now, this is where we address the EU Field Guide, and I want to talk through some methods and tools associated with that. But this is different. Yeah? And interestingly, if you don't know it, art comes before language in human evolution. And we think the evolutionary reason for that is that art allows us to distance ourselves from the material reality into an abstraction. And that means we see novel connections between things that we wouldn't otherwise see. Which is why a lot of us are concerned about an over-focus on STEM education, because if you actually don't have the wider humanities, you're not going to have that innovative capacity to see things. Yeah? And that is something we're all really good at. I've had some of my best ideas looking at paintings or in music, yet breaking that connection with reality through metaphor or abstraction means you see novelty. And we can't replicate that even with Boolean logic in AI. So one of the questions for you as decision professionals is how do you establish the criticality of abductive thinking in decision support in companies when companies are trying to drive everything into artificial intelligence, which can only think inductively? And that's going to be a major question for us over the next few years. So hold that one, because that's a key principle. So I'm just taking a picture so you can have the copy. What we did in the EU Field Guide is we focused on a series of things related to that. But I want to kind of like go through this in two stages. That's a dishwasher. This is designed to illustrate something called anticipatory thinking. Now, there are two ways to stack a dishwasher. One is the evil, reprehensible, unforgivable approach of dumping things in it as you go without any consideration for what is going to come later or how to unpack it later. Yeah, the people who do this are called dumpers. And then there's the intelligent, anticipatory approach, which works out in advance what sort of things we might be eating today, stacks the dishwasher accordingly, and makes sure all the knives are in one section, all the forks are in another, to reduce the time and energy spent on basically breaking a thing, not breaking a thing, but unstacking a thing at the end of the day. Now, stackers are thinking in an anticipatory way. Dumpers are just responding to the present. Let's be honest, how many people here are stackers? How many are dumpers? Yeah, okay. Now, the other phenomenon which I observed, this is anecdotal, but nobody's contradicted it yet, is stackers always marry dumpers and vice versa. There is therefore a state of permanent conflict in any house. Yeah? But training people for anticipatory thinking is something we are not addressing in any school that I know. If you've got a new school on decision support, this is one of the new areas. So if I take this example, this is kind of like a mountain in a lake district. This is where my hobbies are. I've been walking and climbing since I was 3 or 4 years old. I was our mountain rescue for 5 years. That teaches you a lot about anticipation. If you see a lot of accidents, you learn to actually anticipate that. In terms of works, I never go walking without the ability to survive 24 hours. That's kind of like a fundamental rule in terms of the way you work. But the other thing is, if you learn to walk over time, you can see paths. You're constantly monitoring the terrain ahead. Look at almost an unconscious level and seeing patterns in that. So when you arrive in the territory, you can work out where the paths are more likely to be. Or you also have those little heuristics, like never drop height unless you really need to. And all of these come through experience and community interaction over time. And we're not training people for that, and it's more important that we realize because the future is even more uncertain than we ever thought it was. Just to depress you, I sit on a few depressing think tanks located near here. We're having this debate at the moment about where the first 1 million+ heat death will occur. Yeah, not if it will occur, but when it will occur. Because if the temperature goes above 58 degrees, you die. It's that simple. It went to 52 in Rio last year. Right? And the question at the moment is it India? Is it Indonesia? Is it Western Australia? Is it the southern United States? But it's going to happen. Yeah, the refugee problems we're facing now are nothing compared with the refugee problems we will face in 10 years' time. Yeah? So companies, organizations, countries are facing a world where everything is going to be constantly shifting and changing, and we're going to be dealing with what I foolishly called 20 years ago, then had to stop calling it for a bit, the unknown unknowables. Yeah? The things actually that we can't know until they happen, and we can't actually anticipate them. What that means is we've got to start to create organizations which are inherently resilient. And resilient organizations are not efficient. They are inefficient. If a system is efficient, it's lost its evolutionary capacity to adapt. If it's inefficient, it's got capacity and it can adjust. I often make the difference between a salt marsh and a seawall. A seawall is robust, it's very useful, you can drain the landward side until its design conditions are exceeded, at which point it breaks catastrophically. A salt marsh, on the other hand, and if you haven't had Welsh salt marsh lamb, I strongly recommend it, right? A salt marsh absorbs a huge amount of water and it doesn't release it even when it's saturated. It's like my estuary, it's constantly adapting and changing. So a lot of our work is how do you create an organization which is resilient, an organization where you can't anticipate what it's going to face, except that you do know it's going to face high levels of uncertainty. And the only thing I know with absolute certainty about a complex adaptive system is that whatever you do will have unintended consequences. One of the ways that we do that is to use our organization as a sensor network. Remember, some people see a gorilla? One of the most important things in the next generation of decision support or decision science is going to be finding the 17% who've seen something that the other 83% haven't, and then getting executives to pay attention to it. Yeah? So this is an example of a fitness landscape. What we've done here is we've presented a situation to the whole workforce as an infographic. We've asked them all to interpret that situation in the same 5, 10-minute, half-hour period. This is wisdom of crowds, if you know about that. Yeah, in wisdom of crowds, you actually have a Gaussian distribution because nobody can talk with anybody else. Each agent makes a decision independently of each other agent. If they talked with each other, it would form a Pareto distribution, and we couldn't get this result. A famous example on that, if you don't, it's in Saranaki's book, is a US submarine grounded off the coast of Portugal in the 1970s, I think. It didn't sink. I was corrected on that in Norfolk Navy Base by somebody with 4 stars on their shoulder. He pointed out submarines are meant to sink. And I learned from that, if anybody's got that many stars on their shoulder, let them humiliate you in the first 3 minutes, then it's out of their system and they might listen to you thereafter. It's good guidance for talking with senior executives. Either way, what they did is they didn't know where it was, so they gave partial data to different groups of experts around the world, including some Nova Scotia fishermen who know the Atlantic. They all estimated where it was. None of them were remotely right, but a probability distribution of all the estimates was 900 meters away from the submarine. Now, there are sound statistical and cognitive neuroscience terms why that works. So we present a situation to the whole of your workforce. They interpret it in real time, and I haven't got time to go into this, but the thing we developed under the DARPA program is called high abstraction metadata, which is based on semiotics and abstraction, and you don't know what the right answer is. You don't want anybody interpreting something based on what they think is objective truth. You want abstraction, coming back to that principle. And from that, we can draw these maps. So if you look at this map, you can actually see that I've got this group of people who think this group of people. I've also got this group, and that's the 17%. I've got people who are seeing the situation in a radically different way. I've also got an evidence base because this is a strong opinion, so people will go with that. Now, this is, by the way, an alternative to a lot of decision support. We say, if I've got a dominant pattern of interpretation, that's a safe pathway to follow, or a coherent pathway to follow. What I've done here is I've identified 3 coherent pathways I can explore, rather than trying to work out in advance what the right thing is to do. I've also got this fascinating phenomenon that if you go to an executive and show that map and say, look, these guys here have seen something, they're different from everybody else, they'll be called into the office and they'll be listened to. If there's some people knock on the door and say, we've seen something, please pay attention, they'll be ignored. Yeah, if you want to get senior executive attention, they first of all got to be curious. If you don't make them curious, they won't listen. Yeah, so this is a new type of decision support. Yeah? It's also a new type of change, by the way. If we use this for cultural change, what we're trying to do is to shift things into adjacent possibles, but that's for another day. Now, that leads me on to where I want to finish, which is this is the EU Field Guide. You can download this. I'll give the conference organizers the website. If your country has had the sense to stay in the European Union, you don't have to pay postage. If it's had the stupidity to leave, all right, or if you were never in it in the first place, then you'll have to pay postage, but the book is for free. Right? Now, it actually has 5 key things, which is what I want to leave you with as ideas. The first one is what I've just talked about, is building human sensor networks. What I do is I build networks of people with diverse perspective before I know that I need them. Right? One of the things, if anybody's come across Ashby's Law, okay, one of the things I was working on with DARPA when we were working with Poindexter et al. Is how do you stop Ashby's Law being a restriction? Sorry, if anybody wants to talk about this, I'll grab you later. One of the ways you can manage asymmetric threat is to use your citizens as a sensor network so you have asymmetric advantage. Right? Companies can do the same thing. Your customers are a sensor network. Your employees are a sensor network. But you need to work on them in real time, not otherwise. You need to get them working on a basis before you actually need it. The second thing is informal networks. Informal networks are the most important decision-making capability that any organization has. Because informal networks are based on trust, not formal role. Yeah, I checked with a whole bunch of people after COVID. Nobody followed the rules because the rules were developed fundamentally based on formal systems, on knowledge of the past. But now everything has changed, so people fell back to their informal networks. There are techniques in that field guide, like entangled trios, which get people working together in small groups from diverse backgrounds, which within 18 months can have everybody within 2 phone calls of everybody else. And if everybody is within 2 phone calls of the CEO, there's a chance he might get to hear things in sufficient time to do something about it. Right? So building informal networks is building the substrate or the environment in which you can make decisions. Yeah? The third thing, and this is where we're now moving with S-Strime mapping, which you can look up on the website, is we're mapping the energy gradients of the current system. We're trying to understand what we know. And we're trying to understand what are the constraints, what are the actors. We're trying to identify, and this is the new approach to scenario planning, by the way, if you can measure the energy gradients of the present, you've got a better prediction of what will happen in the future. Fundamentally, whatever has the lowest energy gradient will win, and that also indicates which pathways you can take and small actions you can take in the present. You also need to actually map what you know for what's called radical repurposing. In a crisis, you haven't got time to invent things from scratch. You've got to find a completely novel use for things you're already very good at. And if you want 2 good examples of that, the reason why IBM dominated the computer industry so long is before computers came along, it was the worldwide market leader in typewriters and punch card control machines. So it didn't have to invent capability in that, it could repurpose it. In 1947, a Raytheon engineer maintaining a magneto of a radar machine noticed that a chocolate bar melted in his pocket, realized the significance, put a metal box around the magneto, we got microwave ovens. Yeah? The whole history of how do you actually create, it's called exaptation in evolutionary biology, or radical repurposing. You need to map everything you know in the organization so you can find it very quickly and repurpose it when a crisis hits. And what I'm trying, you should get a flavor now, I'm saying you need, as decision professionals, to create a decision-based ecosystem rather than just do analytics in terms of the way you work. And then, kind of like building on this, specialized crews. One of the things we're now working on in decision theory is 5 is the maximum number of active decision makers in an extended family. We evolved to compromise in groups of 5 or less. If you have a big meeting room, and I did this recently in the NHS, you've got ambulance drivers, consultant surgeons, nurses, social workers. They all fall into their tribes, and they fight tribe to tribe. If I take one person from each group and put them together in a small group, and I have 20 small groups, I get better data. What we're now doing, and this has been done in the development banks and also elsewhere, is we're saying if you can assemble 4 roles, and the 5th role is completely anonymous, so nobody knows who it is, you can make any decision and spend a certain amount of money. That's going to take about 60% of the bureaucracy out of a hospital. But what it's doing critically in terms of this evolution, this ecology I'm talking about, is you're creating a capacity for decisions to be made very quickly without hierarchy, but you're not delegating to individuals, you're delegating to people in role combinations with sufficient diversity. And the anonymity gives you audit control. And say that's really important. We evolved to make decisions as groups, not as individuals, so we're kind of like respecting that. So that ability is absolutely key, and building it in advance. And finally, this is kind of like the energy gradient point again in a slightly different way. Now, I want to make the point, and I'm going to finish with 2 very quick slides. If you don't know it, language is fascinating. I'm Welsh, all right? Welsh has no possessive pronouns. So I can't say I have a car. I can only say I am with a car. And that tells you an awful lot about Welsh culture. Yeah, I do a lot with indigenous groups in Australia and elsewhere. The danger with English is we end up with this homogenized meaning, which lacks a lot of the subtleties of different groups in terms of the way we work. But manage, the origin of the word manage is an Italian word, which is the ability to manage a horse in dressage. It then gets corrupted by the French. Yeah, many things have been corrupted by the French. Not as many as by the English, but many. Yeah, to mean household management. The metaphor I'm leaving you with here is data analytics tends to be household management, whereas networks of decision makers is more about riding horses. You need menage as well as you need manage. Yeah, and the danger with an over-focus on analytics is you lose the capacity for human judgment, which is based on pattern recognition, not analytics. And I've tried to give you some indications. The other thing is once you find something new, pay attention to this quote from T.S. Eliot. Yeah, nothing pleases people more than to go on thinking what they have always thought, and at the same time imagine that they are thinking something new and daring. It combines the advantage of security and the delight of adventure. So with that, I will leave you to think about it, but fundamentally, analytics is key, but a decision-based ecology which uses human agents with multiple diverse backgrounds is even more important under conditions of uncertainty, because you need to be the champions of abductive reasoning, not just the executioners of inductive algorithms. Thank you very much for your time.
For questions?
I have a question about your evolve to make decisions.
Oh, it's easy in technology terms. No. Okay, so let me give you an example, all right? So we're working on with a development bank. Development banks can allocate 50 million, but they can't allocate 100 amounts of $500. But everybody knows that $500 would have a better impact. Same is true in companies, by the way. Now, I've been C-level. You know out there people with ideas which aren't getting to you because they're filtered out by middle management. So you can work this across. So what we say, if you can assemble, and we're playing with the groups at the moment, if you can have, this is in the Philippines, the village priest, the head person, the oldest girl in a school, and the youngest boy to hit puberty. Yeah? Now, notice we're bringing young and naive as well as old and experienced. And the fifth role is somebody completely anonymous. You have no idea who it is, but they have to agree with you. That's done in the virtual environment. The reason you have the anonymous role is it means it's called a panopticon effect. You know you're being observed, so you have to be honest. If it's somebody you can influence, you don't. And that's a key element in making this work, right? Because it gives you audit control. What we're doing in a hospital is the most experienced consultant, a doctor straight out of training. This, by the way, is key. It's called the young driver syndrome. Recently qualified drivers will see things that experienced drivers don't. Yeah, so we build those diversity rules in. When we're developing this approach, we run 2 or 3 months of simulation games in which we play with the roles with real-world situations. I'm getting quite depressed at the moment because we're working on end-of-life decisions for children in hospitals, which is not fun. Right? But those are some of the most difficult decisions. So the principle is not that you are delegated with authority, but if you can find this combination of roles who will work with you, and you accept one anonymous person, you can actually have the money, or you can make the decision. Yeah? And the other point about that is if you delegate decisions to individuals, then the stress chemicals are released. So they go into fight or flight. If you delegate to a combination of roles, that doesn't happen. Yeah? Medical groups, army groups, all actually make decisions in highly ritualized role-based combinations because those can actually handle stress, whereas individuals can't. Any more? I'll repeat it for him. He's referencing type 1, type 2 decisions or thinking fast, thinking slow, all right? I love the book. It's got some wonderful examples, but we already knew about that before he started his research. Yeah? It's called autonomic novelty receptive processing. Right? So so if you pull your hand away from a fire, you don't think about it before you do it, but your brain lights up. Now, idiots like Richard Dawkins say that means you haven't got free will, because they're, sorry. Yeah, I know. Right. So fundamentally, what actually happens is it's double checking if the automatic response was right this time or not. And that autonomic side of your brain can handle something like 60,000 items per second. It's very energy efficient. If you get consistent failure, then what actually happens is it triggers a different part of the brain into operation. That handles 20,000 items per second, but it uses a huge amount of energy, so you don't activate it unless you've got to. Now, the way you activate that, that's what he talked about, thinking fast and thinking slow. Right? So the examples are great, but there's already a bunch of cognitive neuroscience which explains it in different terms. The only way you achieve that trigger is to create an anomaly. So the way we make decisions is we're constantly hallucinating. Yeah? Micro hallucinations based on our own memories, the memories of other people through stories. And by the way, the stories of the society in which we exist are far more important for decision making than our brains. Yeah? Our social environment, our body, make far more decisions than our brains do, right? In terms of the way it works. So basically what actually happens is you're doing those hallucinations. Some of them are pure imagination. Those aren't an intelligent camera. That's another mistake you see in decision professionals. They assume it's about information being rationally processed. That's not the way it works. Those the multiple signals which are coming in, and we don't know some of them. We do know, by the way, now that smell plays a large factor in trust. And it's one of the reasons why Zoom conversations may not have the right stimulation for you, right? Olfactory senses are quite important. The Finns have a wonderful word for this. I can't pronounce it, but it means that you need to keep a distance between people to avoid bad smells. And they have one wonderful word for that, all right, which I can share if you want later. So fundamentally, what you're going is you're doing those hallucinations. What then happens is you do a first fit pattern match, not a best fit pattern match. Yeah? Now, you can see why this has advantage. If you think about the early hominoids in the savannas of Africa, something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed. Do you want to autistically scan all available data, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, and having identified lion, look at best practice case studies on how to avoid lions? Yeah, by that time, the only document of any use to you will be the book of Jonah from the Old Testament, which is the only example I've found of a survival guide to escaping from the digestive tract of a large carnivore written by a survivor. Yeah, we evolved to make decisions very, very quickly based on a partial data scan of less than 5% of available data and to do a first fit pattern match. That's how every C-level executive is making a decision. So you have to work with that rather than trying to work against it. Yeah. Okay, so this is a long subject. I'm around all today and most of tomorrow morning, so I'll happily spend more time with you. But just a high-level summary, all right? When I was growing up in South Wales, we had an extended family. And to be quite honest, nobody quite knew where the children were most nights, all right? It sort of just worked. My children have grown up in isolation. Yeah, so actually it's quite interesting. They lack the ability to relate to strangers, because strangers are always introduced. When I was growing up, we played on the street. So you had to accommodate with whoever else was playing on the street, and you learned to manage bullies. Now everything is controlled in terms of the way it works. So I think there's one thing about social interaction, right? The other thing is, and sorry, if this upsets some people, I don't apologize, but I'm prepared to explain it later. Family therapy is the wrong way to go. Yeah? If you look at modern understandings of cognitive neuroscience and the way people develop frameworks, it's by interaction, not by reflection. The reflection comes from interaction, not the other way around. So, for example, some of the projects we're working on, I've just come from Germany, where we're looking at the rise of the far right, and from Finland, where we're really worried about civilian attitudes, because that's now part of national defense. You know, I mean, the scenarios are, if Trump wins, Putin will actually move into Finland or Poland. Those are the main scenarios, right? And they're getting ready for it. Yeah? So we need to measure civilian attitudes. So a lot of our work now is to get schools to act as journalists to their own communities. Yeah? So you don't want somebody from outside. That gives me a huge sense of network. You know, we've done this in Colombia, we've done it in Wales, we've done it in Finland, we're doing it in Germany, and in conversations to do it in the States. If anybody's got any contacts, we're interested. So what you actually do is you use children as sensors to gather stories from their community. That gives you data in real time, and you can come ask questions of that network. But then you can find stories about problems which are common, in your case, to red and blue. And then you can actually, the distributed decision making I talked about, you can say, if you can assemble this small local team, we'll give you a grant to do something. So people actually work together with people they've been taught to hate. And so they have a conversation about their differences in the context of working together. Now, we first did that in Northern Ireland in the 70s, where I took asymmetric groups of Catholics and Protestants and dumped them into the slums of Rio de Janeiro for 6 months. And they pretty soon found out they had more in common than they realized. And they had a conversation about their differences in the context of working together. Now, that's something we want to do algorithmically at scale worldwide. Because in information warfare, the bad actors will always win. Right? Without any question. The way you counter it is to increase empathy between people. Yeah? If people see other people as people, they can't demonize them. Right? And starting to see people as part of an extended network of families, which is called a clan, is actually more healthy for the system. And the final point, because I know he wants me to finish, and I need to be very careful what I say here, right? A friend of mine in the Mounties in Canada summarized it beautifully. He said it used to be that every village had an idiot and it didn't matter because we all knew who the idiots were. And now the idiots have banded together on the internet to legitimize idiocy. Yeah? And I won't go on to my next stage, which I would say in Europe, but I won't say in the States. Right? One of the things that we now lack in an information-centric, a data-centric environment is basically human buffering. Digitization actually is a bad idea. You need analog as well as digital. You need human buffering in systems because otherwise they go out of control. So the family issue is the same as the society issue. It's a fractal relationship.